A crash victim arrived at my ER wearing my missing ring. When I confronted my husband, his reaction changed everything I knew.
Grace Bennett Halloway had spent 22 years learning to read bodies that couldn't speak for themselves. Bruised knuckles told her about a fight that hadn't gone the way the patient claimed. Track marks told her about a private war nobody else in the room could see. 2 decades of emergency medicine at Ridgeview Memorial Hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, had taught her one thing she trusted more than anything a patient ever told her out loud. The body doesn't lie, even when the person attached to it has been lying for years, including to themselves. She met Adam Halloway at a dinner party in Southend 3 years before their wedding. The kind of party where everybody worked in finance or tech and talked about their portfolios the way other people talked about their kids. Grace had come straight off a 12-hour shift, still half in scrub mode, jumpy from 3 codes back to back. And she was standing near the drinks table doing math on how fast she could leave without being rude, when a guy in a grey sweater handed her a glass of wine she hadn't asked for. "You look like you just watched somebody's heart stop," he said. "Literal or metaphorical?" "Literal," she told him. And instead of flinching the way most people did, he leaned against the counter and asked her to walk him through it. The actual sequence, compressions and epi, and the exact second a chest either answers you or doesn't. Most guys at that party wanted to talk about themselves. Adam wanted her to keep talking. 20 minutes in, she'd already thought, "This is the calmest person I've ever met." In a job that dropped her into chaos 5 nights a week, that kind of calm felt like water in the desert. He worked in data consulting for a firm called Vantage Point Analytics, the kind of job that came with a rotating cast of cities. Richmond one week, Nashville the next. Gone often enough that Grace ran the house like a single woman who happened to split a mortgage, and home often enough that she never had to sit with what all that travel actually added up to. He remembered her mother's chemo schedule down to the Thursday appointments and would text on those exact Thursdays, no reminder needed. He sent flowers to her whole floor every nurse's day so nobody felt left out. A gesture so thoughtful it became a running joke at the nurses' station. "Your husband's setting a bar the rest of us have to hear about every May." Everyone who met Adam came away saying some version of the same 3 words in some version of the same order. Steady, warm, a good one. Like he'd rehearsed the exact impression he wanted to leave and never once dropped the act mid-performance. Grace's own mother, not an easy woman to win over, had pulled her aside at the engagement dinner and said, "That one pays attention. Don't lose him." At the time, all Grace heard in any of it was proof she'd chosen well. She had no reason yet to wonder how a person gets that good at being exactly what a room needs him to be. They married 10 years back at a vineyard outside Asheville, the kind of September afternoon where the light does something unfair to everything it touches. Grace's father, gone 2 years by then, wasn't there to walk her down the aisle, and Adam had noticed her go quiet about it a week before the wedding and quietly arranged for her father's favorite hymn to be played by the string quartet without telling her. So it just appeared mid-ceremony and undid her completely in front of 120 guests. She'd married him crying happy tears over a dead man's hymn and thought, in that exact moment, "Nobody will ever know me the way this man knows me." The reception ran long into the night. String lights hung through the vineyard's old oak trees, champagne going warm in glasses nobody bothered to refill anymore. Somewhere around midnight, Grace's college roommate cornered her by the dessert table. a little drunk and grinning.
He's too perfect. You know that, right? I keep waiting for the part where he turns out to have some secret whole other family back in Ohio.
They'd both laughed about it, clinked glasses, and Grace forgot the comment completely within the week. The kind of throwaway line people say at weddings that means absolutely nothing and is gone by the following Monday. She wouldn't think of it again for 9 more years. When she finally did, it would knock every bit of air clean out of her.
They settled into a brick colonial in Myers Park, with a magnolia tree Grace had named Big Steve, for reasons neither of them fully remembered anymore, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who slept diagonally across their bed and had never once, in 8 years, allowed either of them a full night with their feet uncrossed. No kids. They'd talked about it early on, agreed to wait, then let the waiting quietly become the answer, the way a lot of decisions in a marriage get made, without either person ever formally deciding anything. Every anniversary they went to the same restaurant in Dilworth, the same corner booth by the window that Adam always requested 3 weeks out, and every year he lifted his glass and said the same 6 words, eyes steady on hers the whole time. To the only version of this I ever wanted. For 9 straight years, Grace had thought that was the single sweetest sentence anyone had ever said to her. A man toasting the specific, particular life they'd built, instead of some vague fairy tale. She would spend a long time later, after everything, turning that sentence over and over, trying to figure out exactly which version he'd meant, and whether the life they'd built had ever really been the point of it, or just the shape the point needed to take.
If you had stopped Grace on the sidewalk at 7 o'clock on a random Tuesday evening and asked her to rate her marriage on a scale of 1 to 10, she would have said 9, without blinking. The way you answer a question you've never once had a reason to actually think about. Not a 10, because nothing real is a 10, and Grace liked to think of herself as somebody who dealt in the real. She had no idea, standing there with her badge swinging against her scrubs and coffee going lukewarm in one hand, that the number had never once been real to begin with. That somebody had built it for her, brick by careful brick, the same patient way a person builds anything meant to hold weight it was never designed to hold. She clocked in at 7 that evening in late October, badge swinging, coffee in one hand. Rain had started right around sunset, the kind that turns Charlotte's overpasses into a hazard course, and every nurse on the floor knew exactly what that meant for a Tuesday night.
Wet roads brought business.
They always did. Marisol Vega was working triage that night, and the two of them had fallen into the old rhythm inside the first hour. Marisol calling out vitals in that clipped sing-song she used when she was moving fast. Grace already 3 steps ahead of whatever came through the doors next. 12 years working the same trauma bay together had turned them into something closer to a single organism with 2 names than 2 separate co-workers. The kind of shorthand where a look across a gurney said more than a full sentence could. The call came in at 11:40. Single vehicle collision, I-77 northbound near Woodlawn Road. A sedan had hydroplaned, spun across 2 lanes and folded itself against the median. 1 occupant, female, unresponsive at the scene. No ID recovered from the wreck, just a shattered phone and whatever the impact had thrown loose across the wet asphalt. Dispatch logged her as Jane Doe, and Grace didn't think anything of it. Half the traumas that came through on a rainy night arrived without a name attached, at least for the first hour or 2. Grace met the gurney at the doors and didn't think about anything except keeping the woman alive. Glasgow coma scale of 9 on scene dropped to a 6 in transit, which was the kind of number that made everyone in the bay move a little faster and talk a little less. Flail chest. A deep laceration across the collarbone, held shut with nothing but gauze and pressure, and whatever a first responder had managed in the rain with headlights and a flare for light. 40 minutes of controlled chaos later, intubated, stabilized, blood hung, imaging ordered, the patient went up to the surgical ICU, and Grace finally had 30 seconds to breathe. She reached for the woman's personal effects bag, the way she'd done 100 times before, on autopilot. The same routine she followed every single shift. Catalog everything. Bag it, tag it, log it, before the state trooper showed up to ask questions nobody downstairs could answer yet. A single silver hoop earring. The match probably still somewhere on I-77, getting run over by strangers. A phone. Cracked screen gone completely dark. Battery dead, or the impact had killed it outright. And a ring. Rose gold band. A modest solitaire, slightly off-center in its setting. The exact same flaw the jeweler on Providence Road had once offered to fix for free. An offer Grace had turned down years ago because she liked the imperfection. Liked that it made the ring look like it belonged to somebody real instead of a catalog photo. She turned it over, out of nothing but habit, the reflexive motion of a woman who'd worn that same ring on her own hand for a decade, and felt her stomach drop before she'd even finished reading the inscription. Because some older, faster part of her brain already knew what it was going to say. She'd read those 2 words every single night for 10 years. Half asleep, twisting the band while she fell asleep next to a man who slept like nothing in the world had ever once kept him up. Always A. It was her ring. The one she told Adam she must have lost gardening 8 months back, tearing up half the flower bed on her hands and knees in the dark looking for it, crying a little, embarrassed at how much it had rattled her. The one he'd shrugged off with a soft, easy, "It'll turn up, babe," and a kiss on the top of her head. And she'd let it go, because that was one of the things she loved about him. Nothing ever felt like the end of the world when he was in the room. It had never turned up. 8 months later, it turned up here, on a stranger's swollen hand, off Interstate 77, at 1 in the morning, still warm from a body Grace herself had just spent 40 minutes trying to keep alive.
You okay?
Marisol asked, sticking her head around the curtain, already half out the door toward the next bed.
You look like you saw a ghost. This ring.
Grace held it up between 2 fingers, like it might bite her.
It's identical to the one I lost.
Marisol took it, turned it over in the fluorescent light, unimpressed at first.
Rose gold's everywhere right now, Grace. Every counter at South Park's got that exact setting. Half the brides I know this year picked it. It has the same inscription.
That stopped her cold. Marisol read the 2 words, mouthed them silently once, like she was checking her own eyes, then looked back up at Grace with an expression Grace had seen her wear exactly twice before in 12 years. Both times over a patient who wasn't going to make it.
Okay, that's not coincidence-shaped weird, Grace.
That's something else entirely. Grace went back into the effects bag to finish logging the last item, a small spiral notebook, water-damaged, soft at the corners, the kind of $2 drugstore notebook you'd grab in the checkout line without thinking twice. She flipped it open on autopilot, half expecting a grocery list, a to-do list, the ordinary debris of somebody's ordinary life. The handwriting inside wasn't similar to hers. It was hers. The forward slant she'd had since middle school, the lowercase i's dotted with tiny open circles, a habit picked up from an art teacher named Mrs. Bell that Grace had never once dropped in 25 years, not even when she was documenting a code blue with her hand shaking. The open-topped lowercase e's she'd been quietly self-conscious about since a boy named Danny Reeves had made fun of them in the 7th grade. Every stroke, every idiosyncrasy, every tell a handwriting expert would use to identify a single, unique human being. Right there, in a notebook Grace Bennett Halloway had never once seen in her life. Marisol. Her own voice sounded far away, like it was coming through a bad phone connection. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. Marisol looked. Marisol went pale under the fluorescence, a color Grace had genuinely never seen on her before. Marisol did not, notably, tell her she was losing her mind. Grace didn't sleep that night, not for one single minute. At 4 a.m, she sat at her own kitchen table with Biscuit's head heavy and warm on her foot, comparing photos of the mystery notebook against 3 years of her own grocery lists she dug out of a junk drawer she hadn't opened since the last time they'd moved a couch. Every stroke matched. It wasn't a good forgery, it was a perfect one. The kind that only comes from somebody who studied her handwriting stroke by stroke, hour after patient hour, until the copy stopped being a copy of anything and just became a second version of the truth. It wasn't written like a diary either. It read like study notes. Her coffee order, down to the extra pump of vanilla she was faintly embarrassed to order in front of baristas half her age. A story about a childhood beagle named Cooper, told almost word for word the way Grace always told it at parties, right down to the joke at the end about the dog eating an entire birthday cake off the counter. A list of names in the margins. Her mother, her college roommate, a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Each one annotated in small, careful handwriting, like somebody building a file. Like somebody doing homework on a person nobody else in the world knew was being studied. Adam was asleep 2 floors up the whole time, breathing slow and even, the way he always did. The way she used to find so soothing on nights she came home wired from a bad shift. Grace didn't wake him. Some part of her, the same part that had learned to read a patient's face before the monitors caught up, already suspected she wasn't going to like the answer to the question forming in her chest, and she wasn't ready yet to hear him talk his way around it. So instead, she went to work the next morning like nothing had happened, smiled at her co-workers, charted her patients, and started digging in whatever 15-minute gaps she could steal between rooms. Saturday morning, Adam was in the kitchen in his old college t-shirt, making coffee, humming along under his breath to something on the radio like a man with absolutely nothing sitting on his conscience. Grace set the photo of the inscription down on the counter next to his mug, face up, and watched him. "Where's my wedding ring, Adam?" "You lost it. Gardening, remember? You tore up half the flower bed looking for it." "Look at the picture. Tell me that's not our ring." He picked it up. Grace watched his face the exact way she watched a cardiac monitor at 3 a.m, hunting for the flicker before the numbers caught up to it. For half a second, less honestly, less than half a second, the kind of gap you'd miss completely if you hadn't spent 2 decades staring at faces for a living. Something crossed his expression that she could only describe later as recalculation. Like watching somebody run 100 quiet numbers behind their eyes before landing on the one they wanted you to see. Then it was gone,
replaced by something easy and indulgent, and he laughed.
Babe, that's a rose gold solitaire. Kessler sells a dozen of those a month, easy.
It has our inscription, word for word.
People steal inscription ideas off Pinterest, you know that.
It's a coincidence, Grace. He shrugged and turned back toward the coffee maker, closing the subject the way he closed most subjects, gently, without ever seeming to slam anything.
Where's all this coming from, anyway?
There's a Jane Doe in my ICU wearing it.
That got a real reaction out of him. Sharp, brief, there and gone, almost before it fully registered on his face. That's morbid. I don't love that you're spending your shifts thinking about dead strangers' jewelry.
She's not dead. She's critical.
Worse then. He checked his watch, an old habit of his whenever he wanted a conversation to be over without having to say so out loud. I've got a call with the Nashville office in 10 minutes. We still on for Friday? That Italian place in Dilworth?
Sure, Friday.
He kissed the top of her head on his way out of the kitchen, unhurried, exactly the way he always did, like a man walking away from a completely settled matter.
Grace stood there a long time after he left, coffee going cold in her hands, replaying that half second on his face over and over, until she'd worn a groove in the memory of it, the way you replay the moment right before a code, trying to find the thing you should have caught sooner. It was the first lie she'd ever caught him telling in real time, actually watched him build it and hand it to her, fully assembled inside the space of a single sentence. And the worst part, the part that kept her up 2 nights running, was how good he was at it. 10 years married to the man, and she had never once suspected he had that particular skill in his back pocket. She smiled at him anyway on his way out the door, said maybe he was right, let it go on the surface, and started planning underneath it. Grace called Marisol that afternoon and asked her to meet somewhere off Providence Road, far enough from Myers Park that nobody they knew would wander past the window and stop to say hi. I need you to not tell me I'm crazy until I'm all the way done talking, Grace said, and laid it out. The ring, the notebook, the half second on Adam's face that morning. Marisol listened without interrupting once, which for Marisol was practically a religious act. When Grace finally finished, Marisol wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared into it for a second before she spoke. You know I love Adam. Everybody loves Adam. The man remembers my kids' birthdays and he's not even related to them. But Grace, a man doesn't get that smooth explaining away his own wife's wedding ring showing up on a total stranger unless he's had practice at it. That's not a first-time lie. That's a rehearsed one. I don't want to believe it. I know you don't. But you didn't call me out here because you don't believe it, honey.
You called me because you already do, and you needed somebody else to say it out loud first. Grace didn't argue with her because there wasn't anything true left to argue with. She thought seriously for about an hour that afternoon about just letting it go, pretending Saturday's conversation had actually resolved something, going back to her 9 out of 10 life and never opening that particular drawer again. She found, sitting there in the coffee shop with Marisol watching her carefully, that she flatly couldn't do it. I'm going to find out what's going on, Grace said, quietly, before I say one more word to him about any of this. Then let me help you. You are not doing this alone, Grace Bennett Halloway. I mean it. Grace found Denise Okafor on the 3rd floor in Health Information Management, surrounded by 3 monitors and 15 years of hard-earned, thoroughly justified distrust of hospital software. Denise had trained half the record staff currently working at Ridgeview and knew exactly which systems lied to you and which ones just looked like they did.
I need a favor,
Grace said, closing the office door behind her, which she never did.
The Jane Doe from Tuesday night, the I-77 crash. Can you pull her full intake? Not just the medical chart, everything.
Denise typed, frowned, typed again, harder this time. That's strange.
What is?
There's a partial match flag on her insurance lookup that shouldn't be there for an unidentified patient. And somebody, about 3 weeks ago, tried to submit a records linking request, tying an intake file to a completely different patient's account. It got auto-rejected, no authorization on file, but the attempt itself is logged and timestamped, sitting right here.
Whose account did they try to link it to?
Denise turned the monitor around without a word. Grace read her own name off the screen. Her own date of birth. Her own policy number, linked, in a request submitted 3 full weeks before the crash on I-77, to an unidentified female patient file that didn't officially exist yet, because the woman it belonged to hadn't been in an accident yet. Somebody tried to link a Jane Doe's future file to your identity before she was ever a patient here, Denise said slowly, reading it a second time like she wanted very badly to be wrong about it.
That's not a clerical error, Grace.
That's not some intern fat-fingering a form. Whoever did this needed hospital-level access, or a genuinely excellent imitation of it.
Can you tell who submitted it?
It came through an external portal, not internal staff credentials. The login was tied to a healthcare proxy account, the kind you'd set up if you had legal authority to manage somebody else's medical information. Spouse, usually. Sometimes a parent or an adult child, but mostly spouse. Neither one of them said Adam's name out loud. They didn't have to. It sat there in the room with them anyway, taking up all the air. Grace didn't tell Adam any of it. Instead, she did something she had never once done in 10 years of marriage. She went looking for proof against him. Methodically, the way she'd been trained to work up a diagnosis nobody wanted to hear. Rule things out one at a time until only the ugly answer is left standing. Adam kept a rental car rewards account from years of business travel, and Grace still had the password saved from a mountain trip they'd taken together years back. Back when saving each other's passwords had felt like intimacy instead of evidence. She logged in one Wednesday night while he was supposedly in Nashville for work and found 3 straight months of rental history. Every single pickup and drop-off logged at the exact same location. Not Nashville, Richmond. She told him she was covering a shift swap that weekend, which was half true, since Marisol actually did cover for her, no questions asked, and drove 4 hours north with an address she'd pulled from a grocery delivery confirmation buried in an old shared account. Set up, she discovered with a cold little jolt, under a name she had never once heard in 10 years of marriage to this man. A. Doyle. She sat parked across the street from a high-rise near the James River for 3 straight hours on a Saturday, radio off, coffee going cold in the cup holder, watching a lobby door like it might tell her something. At 2 in the afternoon, she watched her husband walk out of that lobby in a jacket she'd never once seen him wear, laughing at something on his phone, looking more relaxed and more purely happy than she'd seen him at home in years. Like a man on vacation from his own life, stepping out of one skin and into another one that fit him better. He climbed into a car that wasn't his and drove off toward the interstate. Grace let him go. Following him now, she knew, would cost her the only real advantage she had left, which was surprise. And surprise was the whole game at this point. It took 2 more trips up to Richmond before Grace actually got inside the building. The 3rd time, she slipped through a loading entrance behind a cleaning crew hauling in supply carts, murmuring an apology about a forgotten key fob to nobody in particular. Nobody looked at her twice. 20 years of walking into strangers' worst days with a clipboard and a confident stride had taught her one durable lesson. Confidence gets you further than any lock ever could. The apartment door was propped open by the same cleaning crew, 2 doors down the hall, vacuum humming somewhere out of sight. Grace told herself she was only looking. She still half believes, telling the story later, that if the door had been shut, she would have turned around and driven home and let the whole thing die quietly. It wasn't shut. Photos on a shelf. Adam, arms slung easy around a woman with dark hair and high cheekbones who looked, in every single frame, unsettlingly like a slightly different version of Grace herself. Same bone structure, same build, same way of tilting her chin at the camera. A closet holding men's clothes Grace didn't recognize, hanging next to women's clothes in a style Grace herself might have picked out on a good shopping day. Mail stacked neat on the kitchen counter, addressed to A. Doyle, and separately, in a second stack, to a Claudia Reyes. A laptop sat closed on the desk. Grace didn't touch it. Some instinct, the same one that had kept her steady through 20 years of trauma bays, told her that was a line even her fear wasn't ready to cross yet. She picked up a tablet instead, tucked in a worn leather cover, and found a notes app locked behind a 4-digit passcode she had exactly no reason to know. She tried their wedding date. Wrong. She tried her own birthday out of pure stupid habit, hands shaking hard enough by then that she nearly gave up on the whole thing and put it back down. And then she remembered a date Adam had mentioned exactly once, years ago, over a candlelit dinner on some anniversary or another. His late father's birthday, he'd said. Easy to remember. And then never brought it up again in all the years since. She typed it in without much real hope. It unlocked. The diary went back almost 2 years, written by a woman named Claudia Reyes, in a plain, patient hand. Grace read as much of it as she dared before the cleaning crew's voices started drifting closer down the hallway toward the propped open door. The very first entry, dated almost 2 years back, read less like a diary and more like somebody trying to talk themselves into something. Claudia had been waiting tables at a steakhouse near the Richmond riverfront, picking up shifts between failed auditions, when a well-dressed regular who tipped generously and always sat in her section started asking careful questions about her life. No family close by, no roommate, a landlord threatening to raise the rent again in the spring. He told her, over several weeks of exactly that kind of small talk, that he ran a private wealth advisory firm and had a client going through a complicated estate dispute that needed a very specific kind of consultant. Someone willing to sign an unusual non-disclosure agreement and play a very particular long-term role in exchange for money that would fix every problem she currently had. He never used the word acting. He used the word assignment. And he made it sound like the kind of secret, respectable work that important people simply didn't talk about at parties. The early entries read almost light at first, disturbingly so. Claudia writing about the assignment like some strange new job she didn't fully understand yet, but was determined to do well at. Grateful even for the first few months, the way you're grateful for anyone who finally seems to see potential in you that nobody else has bothered to notice. Memorizing details lifted from photographs he'd handed her in a manila folder, like something out of a spy movie she used to laugh about with friends. Grace's coffee order. the name of a childhood dog, the exact loop under Grace's capital H, a habit left over from a calligraphy phase in her 20s that Grace herself had nearly forgotten she'd ever had. Handwriting lessons, actual, deliberate, practiced lessons, tracing samples photographed off old birthday cards and grocery lists that had quietly gone missing, one at a time, from a house in Myers Park over the course of nearly a year. Though Claudia never once wrote down where those samples had actually come from, or seemed to ask. 6 months in, an entry read, "He says once I've got the voice right, the walk right, the little things nobody consciously notices but everybody feels, I'll never have to worry about money again as long as I live."
He says I remind him of somebody he lost a long time ago, and that's why he trusts me with this. I told my sister I got a marketing contract in Charlotte. I don't love lying to her. I tell myself it's temporary. The entries got heavier the further in Grace read. A plan Adam referred to, in his own words, as Claudia recorded them, as the transition, discussed in careful, clinical, almost corporate language, like a business strategy instead of a human being's entire life. And then, threaded through the later pages, fear, creeping in a little more with every entry. 2 months before the crash, Claudia had written, "He told me today that once the transition happens, I won't have to pretend anymore." I asked him what that meant for her. He didn't answer me. I don't think I actually want him to. The last entry, dated less than a week before the crash, the handwriting noticeably less careful than the pages before it, like it had been written fast, maybe crying. He stopped explaining things to me. He just gives instructions now. I think I need to talk to her. I think she deserves to know what's coming for her. I'm scared of what happens if I don't. Grace sat down hard on the edge of a stranger's unmade bed, 4 hours from her own house, from her own dog, from her own life, and understood in one long, sick wave that she was not the only victim sitting inside this particular story. There was another woman, 2 hours away in a hospital bed, hooked to machines Grace herself knew the sound of by heart, who had been trying to warn her the exact night everything came apart on a rain-slicked stretch of I-77. She was halfway to the elevator, tablet shoved back in its leather cover, heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her jaw, when she heard Adam's voice drift up from the stairwell. Not the actual words, just the cadence of it. The relaxed, easy register he used when he thought nobody who mattered was anywhere nearby listening. Her whole body went cold at once. She ducked into the opposite stairwell and took the stairs 2 at a time, adrenaline burning through her the exact way it did in the middle of a code. That same narrow tunnel where absolutely nothing exists except the very next move. She made it out to her car with maybe 90 seconds to spare, engine already running before her door had fully shut. From the driver's seat, she watched him walk back inside the building, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something. No idea in the world that his wife had just spent 20 minutes standing inside the middle of his second life. She drove home shaking so hard she had to pull over twice on I-95 just to breathe. She wasn't investigating a strange coincidence anymore, and hadn't been for a while now, if she was honest with herself. She was investigating a man who had planned something with a patience that scared her worse than anything a trauma bay had ever managed to. And if he found out how much she knew before she was fully ready, she had absolutely no idea what a man like that was capable of doing next. That uncertainty, more than anything else that whole long drive home,
was the thing that finally decided her. That was the night she decided she needed help from somebody with a badge. Grace called Ray Delgado the following Monday morning from her car in the hospital parking deck, hands still not fully steady on the wheel.
Delgado worked financial crimes for Charlotte Mecklenburg PD, and he'd been a regular enough presence at Ridgeview over the years, following up on fraud cases, elder abuse, the occasional insurance scam gone violent, that half the nursing staff knew him by first name. He was the kind of cop who remembered the names of the nurses who'd helped him on old cases, which had always struck Grace as a small, decent thing about him. She told him everything, in order, the way you'd give a shift report to the next nurse coming on. Clean, chronological, no editorializing. The ring, the notebook, the rejected records request, the apartment in Richmond, the diary. Delgado didn't interrupt her once, not a single time, the whole way through. When she finally finished, he went quiet on the other end of the line. A specific kind of quiet Grace recognized from 20 years of delivering bad news to families. The quiet of a man doing math in his head that he already had a bad feeling about.
Has he ever asked you to sign anything unusual? Delgado finally said. Insurance paperwork, beneficiary forms, anything that seemed routine at the time but you never actually sat down and read. Grace's stomach turned over again, slow and heavy. 4 months ago, he told me Vantage Point was updating the group life insurance policy. Needed my signature for some kind of internal audit. I didn't read it. He just handed it to me while I was cooking dinner, and I signed it standing at the stove. Do you still have a copy? She did, as it turned out. She'd photographed every single page of it that same night while he was in the shower, a habit born of 2 decades of documenting everything for a living, and sent the photos to Delgado before she could talk herself out of it. He called her back 2 days later, and this time there was no easing into it. That's not an employer-sponsored policy, Grace. It's a private contract through a company called Meridian Life and Casualty. The payout is $2 million. Your husband is listed as the sole primary beneficiary. A pause, long enough that Grace could hear him breathing on the other end. The policy was underwritten 5 weeks before that crash on I-77. 5 weeks before an unidentified woman wearing your wedding ring showed up in your own emergency room. Grace sat down hard on her kitchen floor, right there on the tile, Biscuit pressing his whole warm body against her side, like he could physically feel the ground shifting underneath both of them. Delgado's investigation moved fast after that, and it moved somewhere Grace never once saw coming. Adam's employment history checked out fine on the surface. Vantage Point Analytics was a real firm. The paychecks were real, direct deposited on schedule for a decade. But his history before Grace ever met him hit a wall at exactly 12 years back. No school records anywhere in the system.
No credit history older than a decade, which for most people simply doesn't happen. Not by accident, and not without a great deal of deliberate effort. It was a fingerprint from an old Ohio arrest record, a minor charge, decades stale, that had nearly been purged from the system entirely, that finally cracked it wide open. 8 years before Grace ever laid eyes on him, a man named Peter Doyle had been the primary beneficiary on a life insurance payout after his wife, Renata Doyle, died in a house fire outside Cleveland. The death had been ruled accidental at the time, though the original detectives on the case had flagged some inconsistencies in Doyle's timeline for that night. Inconsistencies that never got resolved before the file went cold and eventually got shelved for good. Doyle collected the settlement, quietly closed out every account with his name on it,
and disappeared off the map completely.
2 years after that, a man calling himself Adam Holloway had appeared in North Carolina with a brand new Social Security number and, in time, a marriage license carrying Grace Bennett's name right next to his.
"We think he's done this before," Delgado told her one evening, sitting at her own kitchen table, the same table where she'd once rated her entire marriage a 9 without giving it a second thought, back when a 9 had seemed like a perfectly reasonable, well-earned number. "We think Claudia Reyes was being prepared to replace you. On paper first, and then eventually in person. The ring, the handwriting practice, all of it. That was never romance, Grace. That was rehearsal. He was building a second you, slow and careful, the same way he built the first one, once, a long time ago, in Ohio." "You think he was going to kill me?" "I think a man who profited once off a wife's death doesn't leave that kind of money sitting on the table a second time by pure accident."
I think we got to this before he finished whatever he had planned.
And I think that's the only reason we're sitting here having this particular conversation tonight, instead of a very different one. The weeks that followed were, without question, the hardest of Grace's entire life. Harder than nursing school finals, harder than losing her father, harder than any single shift she could remember in 2 decades of emergency medicine. Delgado asked her to keep living exactly like normal, while his team quietly built a case solid enough to hold against a man who had, by every indication, done this before, and walked away entirely clean the first time. So Grace cooked dinner. She asked about his day at the office, listened to the answers, laughed in the right places at his jokes. She let him kiss her goodnight, and then lay awake next to him afterward. Every single time. Heart pounding loud enough in her own ears that she was genuinely certain he'd hear it straight through the mattress between them. She became the best actress she had never once wanted to be, holding her own terror perfectly, professionally still. The same exact discipline that let her give a calm, steady voice to a dying patient's family in a consultation room. Except this time, the patient whose fate hung in the balance was herself. One close call very nearly ended everything early. Adam came home in the middle of a weekday afternoon, no warning, while Grace was mid-call with Marisol about the case, phone on speaker on the kitchen counter. She barely got it hung up before he walked through the door.
"Who was that on the phone?"
he asked, setting his keys down. "Marisol, shift swap for Saturday." Half true, at least, which was starting to feel like the only kind of true Grace had left in her.
He nodded, easy as anything, and Grace genuinely had no idea standing there whether or not he believed a single word of it. Her mother noticed something was off before Adam ever did, which didn't surprise Grace in the slightest. The woman had spent 40 years reading Grace's face across a kitchen table and wasn't about to stop now, just because Grace had gotten better at lying to everyone else.
"You're somewhere else lately,"
her mother said one Sunday afternoon on the phone, no preamble, the way she said most things.
"Is everything all right with you and Adam?"
Grace had to sit with the phone pressed to her ear for a long moment, throat tight, before she trusted her own voice enough to answer.
"Everything's fine, Mum. Just tired. Work's been a lot."
It was the hardest lie she told that whole ugly season. Harder even than the one she told Adam, because her mother had earned better than that from her a long time ago. And Grace knew it, even as the words were leaving her mouth. She hung up afterward and sat on the edge of her bed and cried for exactly 4 minutes, timed on the clock, because that was all the time she could afford to give it before she had to put her face back together and go make dinner for a man she now understood might be counting down the days until he didn't have to pretend anymore either. They kept the standing Friday reservation at the Italian place in Dilworth that week because cancelling it out of nowhere would have raised exactly the kind of question neither of them could afford right then. Adam raised his glass at their usual corner booth and gave the same toast out of pure habit, even though it wasn't their anniversary, hadn't been for months. Grace clinked her glass against his, smiled the way a decade of practice had taught her to smile, and thought, clear enough in that moment to nearly take her breath away mid-sentence, I am sitting across a candlelit table from a man who has already decided exactly how I'm going to die.
She excused herself to the restroom right after and stood there, gripping the edge of the sink with both hands for a full minute, just breathing, before she trusted her own face enough to walk back out and sit back down across from him and finish the meal like nothing at all had happened. Claudia Reyes came out of her coma on a Thursday morning, 3 full weeks after the crash, in a hospital 2 hours away from Ridgeview, where Delgado had quietly arranged for her transfer once he understood exactly who she was to this case. Grace wasn't in the room for it. Delgado was, along with a state trooper and a victim's advocate the hospital had assigned. And what Claudia told them that morning confirmed everything Grace had already pieced together on her own, and something considerably worse than anything Grace had let herself fully imagine, even at her most frightened. Even in the middle of the night, with Biscuit pressed against her side.
Claudia hadn't hydroplaned, not the way the original accident report had assumed from the skid marks and the weather. She'd been driving straight to Charlotte that night, specifically to find Grace and tell her the truth, in person, face to face, whatever it cost her personally to do it. She'd texted Adam that same afternoon to say exactly that she was done, that she was going to warn his wife no matter what happened to her afterward. The last thing she clearly remembered before the crash was a pair of headlights closing in fast behind her in the rain, and then the deliberate, precise jolt of another car striking her rear bumper, hard enough to send her spinning across 2 lanes into the median. She never got a clean look at the driver's face through the rain and the dark. But in the smeared wash of her rearview mirror, in the 1/2 second before impact, she'd recognized the car itself. It was Adam's. Grace went to visit her 2 days later, alone. No lawyer, no Delgado. Just the 2 of them in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old vending machine coffee. 2 strangers, bound together for life now by the same man's decade of careful, patient lies. "I'm sorry," Claudia said, her voice still rough and thin from the ventilator tube. "I was coming to warn you. I should have done it months before I finally worked up the nerve to." "You could have died trying," Grace said, and reached out to take her hand, the exact same way she'd take the hand of any frightened patient on any given shift. Because underneath every other complicated thing sitting in that room, that was exactly what Claudia still was to her. A patient. A person who'd been hurt and needed someone to sit with her in it. Grace agreed to wear a small recording device for one final conversation, at Delgado's careful request, once the case was close to airtight and they needed just one more piece to close it clean. She found Adam out in the garage on a Tuesday evening, loading a duffel bag into a car she'd never once seen before, parked exactly where her own car usually sat. He startled at the sight of her, just for a second, then recovered fast, flashing the same easy smile he'd been using on her successfully for 10 straight years. "Heading out early for a work thing," he said. "Didn't want to wake you getting ready." "I know about Richmond." His smile held for exactly 1 more second, before it finally, visibly, started to slip off his face. "I know about Claudia. About the ring.
The real one, with our inscription. The one you gave to her. About the insurance policy. $2 million, Adam. I know your name isn't actually Adam Halloway. Whatever he'd spent 10 patient years building came apart all at once, like scaffolding losing every single bolt in the exact same instant. He didn't deny a word of it. He didn't apologize, not once, not even reflexively.
He just looked at her, flat and assessing. A total stranger standing there, wearing her husband's face like a coat he'd finally decided to take off. You were never supposed to find any of this. Claudia wasn't going to disappear quietly for you. That's why you ran her off the road. She was going to ruin everything I built. Everything you built? Or everything you stole? Peter! Don't call me that. Real anger flashed across his face for the first time since she'd walked in. The first genuinely unrehearsed thing she'd seen from him in longer than she could remember. You have no idea what I actually built here. Vantage Point is real. This house is real. 10 years of birthdays, of sitting with your mother through chemo in waiting rooms. You think all of that was nothing. You think I faked all of it. I think you're very good at making things look real, Peter. That's not the same thing as them being true. His jaw tightened hard. For one strange second, he looked less like a man who'd just been caught, and more like a man who'd genuinely been wounded. The single closest thing to honest Grace had ever seen cross his face in the entire time she'd known him. He reached for the duffel bag anyway, like some part of him was still running the old script out of pure muscle memory. That was exactly when the garage door lifted up behind her, flooding the whole space with red and blue light. DELGADO had been parked down the block the entire time, waiting on her signal. Adam didn't run. There was nowhere left for him to go, and some part of him, Grace thought later, watching them cuff him, seemed almost relieved the running was finally over. Grace showed up for every single pre-trial hearing, even the short procedural ones her victim's advocate told her she didn't technically need to attend. She sat in the third row, same seat every time. Close enough to see him, but far enough back that she never once had to be in the same conversation as him again. The man in the defendant's chair wore a grey suit the county apparently provided for hearings, and he sat up straight through all of it, hands folded, watching the proceedings with a calm, attentive expression of somebody sitting through a mildly interesting quarterly meeting. It was, Grace thought more than once, the exact same face he used to wear across the dinner table from her, and it made her sick in a way she hadn't fully braced herself for. The prosecutor, a sharp, unhurried woman named Assistant District Attorney Renee Whitfield, laid the case out over the course of 8 trial days, like she was building a house nobody would ever be able to knock down. The rental records first, then the insurance paperwork, then a financial forensics witness who walked the jury slowly through how a man with no verifiable history before the age of 30 had managed to construct an entire second identity, complete with credit, employment, and eventually a marriage license. Grace testified on the 4th day. She'd rehearsed it in her head 100 times in the shower, in the car, lying awake next to an empty side of the bed. And none of that rehearsal made the walk up to the witness stand feel any less like stepping into a trauma bay with her own name on the chart. She identified the ring. She identified the notebook, its water-damaged corners, her own handwriting staring back at her from a stranger's hand. She described in the same flat, clinical voice she used to deliver a difficult diagnosis the half-second on his face in the kitchen the Saturday she'd first shown him the photograph. the one detail the defense attorney tried hardest to shake loose on cross-examination, suggesting over and over that grief and suspicion could make a person see things that weren't really there. Grace looked him dead in the eye and said, "I've spent 22 years reading faces for a living, sir. I know the difference between grief and a man doing math." The defense attorney didn't ask her anything else after that. The case never made it to a jury verdict. On the 6th day, after Claudia's recorded deposition played for the courtroom, her voice flat and careful, describing headlights closing fast in the rain and the deliberate jolt of the impact, something visibly shifted at the defense table. By the following morning, Doyle's attorney had a plea agreement on the table. Guilty to attempted murder, insurance fraud, identity theft, and a long list of related financial charges, in exchange for the state not pursuing every possible additional count and not seeking the maximum on all of them stacked together. Doyle took it. He stood at the plea hearing in his grey suit and said the word guilty 4 separate times in the same even, unbothered voice he used to use to ask Grace how her shift went. And Grace sat in her usual seat in the 3rd row and felt something in her chest finally, quietly unclench for the first time in months. At sentencing, the judge gave him 28 years, restitution to be determined, no possibility of an early plea reduction, given the pattern the court had seen laid out across 2 states and 2 women's lives. Doyle was given the chance to speak before the sentence was read. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and said only, "I'd like the record to reflect that I never once stopped caring about either of them, in my own way." It was, Grace thought, listening to it from the 3rd row for the last time, maybe the truest and the most useless sentence he'd ever said in her presence. An answer that explained everything about him, and nothing at all about the women he'd spent a decade using. Adam, Peter Doyle, as the courts now formally knew him, was charged with attempted murder for the crash that had nearly killed Claudia Reyes, along with insurance fraud, identity theft, and a thick stack of financial charges that took prosecutors most of the following year to fully untangle. Investigators up in Ohio reopened the old file on Renata Doyle's death once the fingerprint match came through. Doyle pleaded not guilty at first, then took a plea deal once his defense attorneys saw the full weight of what Delgado's team had assembled against him. The rental records, the diary in Claudia's own handwriting, the rejected hospital request, and Claudia's own sworn testimony about the headlights closing in behind her that night in the rain. Claudia herself was never charged with anything. She spent months afterward in physical therapy, relearning to walk without pain, and considerably longer than that, she told Grace once over coffee, relearning to trust her own judgment about people again, after everything. The fraudulent insurance claim got frozen within a week of Delgado's very first phone call, and voided permanently once the extent of the fraud came fully to light in court. Grace and Claudia met one more time outside a courthouse, months after the trial had wrapped. They didn't hug. Neither of them particularly needed to.
"I'm sorry I scared you," Claudia said. "Showing up wearing your ring like that, in your own hospital of all places."
Grace shook her head.
"You didn't scare me, Claudia. In the end, you're the one who saved me."
And something in both of them, standing there on the courthouse steps in the thin winter sunlight, finally let go for good. The ring itself went into a police property room Grace never once planned on visiting again, and never did. She didn't miss it. Not the way she'd honestly expected to in the weeks right after the trial. A year later, she bought herself a plain gold band with no inscription at all. Nothing borrowed or copied from another woman's careful, practiced script. and she wore it on her right hand instead. Not as any kind of wedding ring, but as a small daily reminder that she got to decide now, entirely on her own terms, exactly who she was and who she wanted to become next. She sold the house in Myers Park within the year, unable to shake the feeling of walking through rooms that had spent a full decade quietly hosting someone else's carefully rehearsed performance. She bought a smaller place closer to the hospital, painted every single wall a color she picked out entirely on her own, without asking anybody's opinion first, and kept Biscuit, who never seemed to notice much difference in any of it. Only that his person still came home to him every single night, and still scratched behind his ears exactly the same familiar way she always had. Grace Bennett Halloway still works nights at Ridgeview. She still runs Trauma Bay 2 like a woman who's made a hard-won kind of peace with chaos. The kind you can only make after chaos has personally come looking for you at home, instead of staying safely contained inside the hospital walls, where she'd always assumed it belonged. Her co-workers say she reads patients faster than anyone else on the entire floor these days. Catches the small thing, the story that doesn't quite line up with the wound in front of her, the half-second hesitation before an answer that's clearly been rehearsed one time too many to sound natural anymore. They think it's pure instinct. Grace knows better than that, even if she rarely bothers explaining it out loud anymore. She earned it, the hard way, over a single autumn that took her whole carefully built life apart, piece by piece, and then made her build a sturdier one back up again, from whatever pieces turned out to actually be hers to keep. She kept her married name, every single syllable of it, when plenty of people quietly assumed she'd want to shed it the first chance she got. Somewhere in the middle of that long, brutal year, she decided the name belonged to her now, not to him, not to whoever he'd really been underneath it. And she flatly wasn't giving away one more single thing that was rightfully hers to keep. Not after everything it had already cost her to hold on to herself. Marisol still works triage most nights Grace is on, and neither of them has ever really talked about that stretch of months out loud, not in any real detail. They don't need to. Some things get folded into a friendship without a formal conversation about it. The way 12 years of trauma bays folds two people into something closer to family than co-workers. Denise still runs health information management on the 3rd floor, and every so often, when a chart looks the slightest bit off to her, she'll walk it down to Trauma Bay 2 herself, instead of just flagging it in the system. Because some habits, once you've seen what they can catch, are worth keeping, even after the reason for them is gone. Ray Delgado retired from financial crimes 2 years back and sends Grace a card every October, the same month the crash happened. Just a line or two, checking in. She always writes back the same day. The body doesn't lie. She still believes that completely, maybe more now than she ever did before. It just took a stranger's crash on a rainy interstate and a notebook full of her own careful handwriting in a stranger's hand to teach her the rest of that lesson. The part nobody had ever bothered to teach her in 20 years of nursing school and continuing education credits. Some people don't need their bodies to lie for them at all. They just need you to stop looking closely enough to notice. Grace had spent her entire career becoming exactly the kind of person who doesn't stop looking. She simply hadn't known, not until that particular autumn, exactly how much it would end up costing her to finally find that out about herself, and about the man she'd shared a bed with for 10 years without ever once seeing all the way through him. These days, on the rare quiet nights, Grace sits out on her new back porch with Biscuit's head heavy on her foot,
exactly the way it used to be, and thinks about the 9 she once gave her old life without a second thought. She doesn't rate things that way anymore. Some things, she's decided, were never meant to be reduced to a single number in the first place. Not a marriage, not a person, not a decade of careful mornings that felt real enough at the time to build an entire life on top of. What she has now isn't a number either.
It's just hers, plainly and completely, in a way the old life never quite managed to be, no matter how good the performance had been. Would you ever suspect your spouse of living a double life? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell.